great pleasure of mine to welcome everyone here at All Souls College and everyone who is joining us today online to another edition of the wonderful IMCC seminar series. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers, Anna Wilson, Seb Wilkes, and Scott Hale. So Anna is the head of the Language Studies Teaching Fellow and Senior Research Fellow at Oxford School of Global and Area Studies here at the University of Oxford. She's also the director of the IMCC, the International Multimodal Communication Center here at Oxford. And she's a co-principal investigator and project lead on numerous international academic research collaborations. Seb Wilkes, I hope I'm
Wilkes,
is a DPhil PhD candidate and research assistant with a background in physics. He hopes to bring a quantitative and dynamics-based perspective to multimodal communication. So it's our pleasure to have Seb here today. And finally, Dr. Scott Hale is an associate professor and senior research fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute and a fellow of the Alan Turing Institute. Scott develops and applies techniques from computer science to research questions in all of social sciences. So without further ado, I'll
we'll swap places.
Yes, swap places for a moment.
Yeah, because we have the camera job. Okay. So here we go. The title of our talk today is Multimodal Analysis of Misinformation and Disinformation. And well, as falsities proliferate in everyday society, so does the collective need to fully understand the nature of this threat. We start from asking the questions: what is disinformation? What is misinformation? What is fake news? We define disinformation in line with the UK's online harms white paper of April 2019 as the deliberate dissemination of information that is false with the express aim to mislead or obfuscate. Misinformation is similar but lacks intentionality. Disinformation can lead others into misinformation. I see, right. Sorry, I'm a Mac person. We see fake news as a subcategory of dis and misinformation. And so what is multimodal? Disinformation and misinformation, which is not fakes. Our ongoing research on disinformation and misinformation show that there is a need to analyze both, and not just in the sense of verifiably incorrect information via fact-checking, but also in the form of certain types of framing of information or viewpoint construction, which aim to mislead or obfuscate, less explicitly, but more insidiously. Consider just one example. The analysis of a Russian TV talk show Pravo Golasa, translated as a right to voice one's opinion, which ran between 2012 and 2019. The show's representative of Russian disinformation communicated in covert ways. It discusses domestic and international news and invites guests with alternative anti-Kremlin viewpoints for the sole purpose of discrediting them in subtle, clever ways. On the surface, the program seems to be supporting an exchange of views, arguments, and constructive critique. In reality, the anchor and the whole production crew uses a wide range of multimodal strategies to ensure that the alternative viewpoints are discredited, but the manner of doing so is almost invisible to the untrained eye. At the same time, disinformation is communicated in an engaging and memorable way. In one episode from February 2016, discussing Ukrainian politics and the outcomes of Maidan, the Ukrainian Revolution of 2014, the anchor relies on frames and conceptual metaphors such as self-other, Russia is great power, Ukraine is ill, and anarchy and banditism in Ukraine versus law and order in Russia. The construction of discrediting viewpoints is rooted in cultural and historical knowledge shared by Russians and Ukrainians. The anchor employs a range of manipulation techniques grounded in the co-presence of speech and co-speech gestures. For example, he uses didactic gestures to construct a strong overarching message. Ukrainian people are self, yes, that's what you see in the image, versus Ukrainian politicians / government or other. He first works hard to present the purposefully selected pro-Ukrainian panelists as incompetent, untrustworthy, and corrupt. He then encourages the audience to associate their impression of the panel with all Ukrainian politicians and the whole of Ukrainian politics. Every time the anchor talks about Ukrainian authorities and politicians in a discrediting way, he gestures towards the Ukrainian panel, the hand gesture pointing to the other. In contrast, the anchor brings his hands close to his chest when talking about the Ukrainian people. The self gesture, the self gesture, normally accompanies words like I, self, myself, my own, etc. The position of the gesture and the handshake, fists, communicates to the TV audience's emotion, feeling, the ideas of trustworthiness, okay, I'm telling the truth, but at the same time, ideas of strength, force, container, in other words, the inclusion of the Ukrainian people into the Russian people self, and a positive evaluative stance, as well as epistemic stance of certainty. Let me play a video clip, just a few seconds, to show to you how that happens. You see what he's doing? He's pointing to the pro-Ukrainian panel, which is right there to his right.
Что, ну, я не знаю, там даже не к кризису, а может быть там к очередному Майдану. Народ, в конце концов.
This is, she just did that gesture. So basically that's how that happens. So conceptualizations like this one, Ukrainian people is self versus Ukrainian government, politicians is other, and he labels them as circus, free reign, bandit, anarchist rule, murderers, I mean, you name it. And I'm giving you just literal labels, but he's using metaphors, which are much more powerful, have continued to be communicated by Russian state media as disinformation until present time. So that happened in 2016. So you can imagine that has been going over, or has been going on for years. This conceptualization was among the key ones on which Putin relied in his speeches of the 23rd and 24th of February 2022, while justifying the start of Russia's special military operation, the war against Ukraine. And more recently, in, for example, Putin's speech at the ceremony of annexation of Ukrainian regions on 30 September 2022. Such conceptualizations constitute weapons of communication. Sorry. Okay, so the very nature of multimodal analysis, the analysis of visual, verbal, and sound modes, modalities, in the context necessitates the development and application of multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary approaches, a task which is often trivial. Research on disinformation, misinformation naturally adds yet another layer of complexity. So the importance of considering disinformation and misinformation through multimodal and interdisciplinary lenses and associated challenges motivate our research questions, namely, to what extent have studies across different disciplines engaged with multimodal analysis of dis or misinformation? What is the extent of interdisciplinary practices within the field? What methods and data are used by the studies of multimodal disinformation and misinformation? What modalities do studies engage with? What value does multimodal analysis add according to the studies? Is there a well-formed research for multimodal analysis of this misinformation? What are the challenges this field is facing? What types of multimodal studies of dis or misinformation add value to the field and in what ways? And I'm handing over to Paul.
Perfect. So we conducted the analysis over 2 stages, and I'm going to talk through stage 1, which basically goes up until the beginning of the pandemic. And I should say that this work was primarily done by Yoei Terimoto, who was a research assistant on the project. So we wanted to go through and sort of do a systematic literature review. We followed the PRISMA framework for that, and we wanted to find studies that met 3 criteria. They needed to be about mis or disinformation, broadly defined. That could be propaganda, fake news. Authors used a variety of terms for that. We wanted to make sure, obviously, that was one aspect. They needed to talk about media or social media. So that could be broadcast media, more traditional things, but also it could be online, social media. And I'll say there that that's sort of the limit for why we only looked at studies after 1900, right? You know, even if it was a study actually published, you know, last year or whatever in 2010, if it was about ancient Rome and propaganda, it's not in our literature review. We really wanted to focus on sort of modern, quote, or at least traditional broadcast mass media through to modern social media. And then, of course, the last point is that it had to be multimodal. So, right, misinformation, media, traditional or social media, and then obviously multimodal, more than just text or just image, had to at least have 2 aspects there. So we went to Scopus. We had this big long query, which essentially breaks down into those 3 points of, you know, mis and disinformation, things around multimodality, and then points on media or social media. And that returned to us 980 articles. We ran that query in March or April 2020. Then we started to massage the data. We found some duplicates, went through all the abstracts and titles, and were able to throw away a big part of those. Some of them were medical science or just things that didn't meet those 3 criteria when you actually looked at the abstracts. And so ultimately we found 303 articles based on those criteria from that we could assess from the title of the abstract. I'm going to speak about those articles and present some more quantitative findings. Then I'll hand back to Anna for more on a deeper dive on 49 papers where we read qualitatively through and really went through those in depth. The difference here is that when we got to the qualitative analyses, we threw out, some things that we couldn't access, even though we had the title abstract, there just wasn't a copy anywhere available online. We threw out review articles that weren't presenting original empirical results, things of that nature. Or maybe also once reading it, a few of them didn't meet the 3 criteria despite appearing to from the abstract. So here we go. First off, no surprise maybe, but from sort of 2010 onwards, there starts to be a big increase in the number of publications. But they do go back, and there are studies even from the 80s, looking at multimodal mis and disinformation in media at that point. Most of these, and the next slide will show this even more, are from the social sciences, and so lots of journal articles, fewer conference papers or book chapters there. Also, I should say that the drop in 2020 is only because we only had the first quarter of 2020 up to the pandemic, right? So ignore the drop if you like. The number of publications per author is really skewed towards most authors appearing in this data set had one publication in our, meeting our criteria. Only a few had 2, 3, or 4. And so what I'd suggest from this is that what we were finding are people who either studied multimodal communication a lot, and they sort of did, one study on mis or disinformation, or conversely, people who did maybe mis or disinformation work, and they had one study that was multimodal, right? But we weren't finding is sort of authors who were generating lots of papers consistently looking at this combination of multimodality and mis or disinformation. Same thing, actually, when we look at the journals that these were being published in, there wasn't sort of one obvious case. Maybe, I come from natural language processing, and so there's a series of conferences, ACL, for instance, Association of Computational Linguistics is one of these big ones. Everyone, tries to publish there or one of its associated conferences. And so it's really, sort of centralized. You kind of know where to go for those papers. In this case, we weren't seeing, sort of a journal of multimodality mis or disinformation studies, right? Like instead, lots of these studies are appearing in just many different journals, and most of them, will have 1, maybe 2 studies that met our criteria, but you can get a sense that actually they're spread over a large number of journals. As mentioned, many of these were coming from the social sciences and the arts and humanities. Computer science is in 3rd place here. In stage 2, Seb will talk more about that, and we'll see a sort of surge in computer science interest from the start of the pandemic. It's not that misinformation is sort of new to computer science at that point. It was already sort of a hot topic. And multimodality also has been a hot topic in computer science for a while. But again, it's really the intersection of those two things that we weren't seeing many studies from computer science, or at least we were seeing more from the social sciences and humanities that had both of those elements, multimodality and mis or disinformation, up until the start of the pandemic. Digging in just a little bit deeper, and these classifications all come from the Scopus database. We can see, within arts and humanities and social sciences, it's communications, sociology, political science, international relations, that are primarily where those studies are coming from. And finally, just again, at this large quantitative level over the abstracts, we looked at whether they were qualitative, quantitative, or both. And there's a mix of papers that are qual, a mix of papers that are quant, but again, a smaller number that are really doing mixed methods. And yeah, we'll come back to that in the qualitative analysis. Final thing for me was just to look a little bit at any of the broad themes, the topics that we could find within this. This was based on LDA topic modeling. So we took all the titles and abstracts, ran LDA. It's this unsupervised method to try to find which words are sort of often co-occurring together. Through various goodness of fit measures, we can say, okay, 4 topics was generally a good fit. And these are the top words that were associated when we run the algorithm asking for 4 topics. What we've actually said as annotation there then is our interpretation of those words, looking at the titles and abstracts of the papers that load strongly on each topic and the words there. And so one of them, propaganda, ISIS, media, war, right? It sort of is more the religious propaganda. A second topic is much more around particularly social media, online communication. And I'll make this clear on the next slide, but this third one here, number 2, which is labeled gender, religion, and war, is a little bit of a catch-all. And it's the least well-defined of all these topics. And then the final one, more focused on political propaganda in particular. And so, yeah, just digging into those, we can see the frequencies of them here. This is a log scale. And So the religious propaganda, online social media, and then political propaganda are, have a lot of articles in them. They're pretty well defined. This second number, topic 2 on gender, religion, or war is the one that doesn't have too many articles. And it also seems to sort of correlate with the other topics. So it's not particularly well defined. Oh, I see. I'm not actually, you're not actually seeing my cursor. Oh, I've been pointing at the screen to myself. Thanks, Seb. And so anyway, yeah, this is, topic 2 here, gender, religion, war, not particularly prevalent and quite correlated with other things. What we'll notice is that the others are actually not all that correlated together. And so, there's sort of a lot that, not, we don't see things on sort of political propaganda and online social media or vice versa, again, leading up to the pandemic. Then, yeah, we went back to qualitative analysis, and we'll hand back to Anna to dive in a little bit more there.
Thank you, Scott. Right. So as Scott said, at stage 1, we included 49 articles into the in-depth qualitative analysis. And for the purpose of this presentation, I am going to focus on the methodologies employed as well as the definitions of misinformation and disinformation. There were other dimensions which were also of interest to us, but we didn't have enough time to present it all. So all articles we started looked at an aspect of how information can be manipulated or distorted in media. At the same time, more than half of the articles did not provide any definition of disinformation or misinformation. Only 5 articles provided a definition of disinformation, and 4 articles provided a definition of misinformation. 8 articles provided a definition of fake news. Only 1 article used the same definition as used by the UK's Online Harms White Paper 2019, which I think was quite interesting. None of the articles analyzing misinformation noted the unintentional nature of misinformation, and this is obviously in line with the definitions provided by the government. This suggests a lack of understanding of the mechanisms and subtleties of misinformation in our view. Anticipating a bit, I'd like to say that we observed the same tendency for our stage 2 analysis, which Sam will present. Our qualitative meta-analysis revealed quantitative methods were used by 20 articles, while qualitative methods were used by 22 articles. 7 papers used a combination of quantitative and qualitative analysis. So 22 studies that researched disinformation or misinformation through qualitative methods fall into broad 3 categories. 11 papers used some form of discourse analysis as their core method, as rooted in linguistics, rhetoric, and or social semiotics, while combining their discourse analysis with a number of other theories and methods key to their analysis of content. 7 papers engaged in content analysis while using approaches originating from political communication, sociology, history, philosophy, and anthropology. There was quite a broad variety there of the frameworks employed. 6 papers did not have a clearly defined theoretical and methodological framework at all. I mean, at times, I must say, it looked like, a journalist article rather than a scholarly paper. Out of 22 papers, only 12 engaged in multimodal analysis of content, which relied on a defined theoretical and methodological framework. So that's solid foundation in this particular respect. Only 4 papers from category 1 relied on an approach rooted in linguistics and social semiotics for multimodal analysis of discourse and communication of dishonest information. That was quite revealing because in general, there was quite a large body of research done on multimodal communication in cognitive and corpus linguistics, as well as experimental psychology. But both disciplinary areas have been conspicuously absent from multimodal research on disinformation and misinformation. Right. 20 papers which used quantitative methods fell into 5 categories. 15 papers used some form of black box statistical analysis. 6 papers applied interpretable statistical methods to analyze data. 2 papers focused on the creation of multimodal disinformation databases. Only 1 paper included network and spatial distribution analysis to investigate how disinformation spreads. 1 paper discussed the development of software to perform fact-checking. Except for 3 papers in category 2, all the publications originated from computer science. Advanced quantitative methods to detect multimodal disinformation in computer science papers were prioritized over investigating multimodal features of disinformation, misinformation, and the role these modalities play in disinformation and multimodal communication. Well, only 7 papers used combinations of quantitative and qualitative methods and fell within 3 broad categories. Expanding the first category, expanding qualitative analysis with quantitative approaches. Then attempting to clarify quantitative results by subsequently applying qualitative analysis, and a collection of disparate methods used as part of a single topic of investigation. We note that the interdisciplinary approaches adopted by these papers, which used mixed methods, unlocked the possibility of doing analysis at scale and enabled new insights. And over to Sam.
Yeah. Sorry, we'll come back to that. Sorry. Right. Okay. So stage 2 was all the papers that fell from March 2020 up to August 2022. And as we sort of hinted at before, we have an exponential growth of papers. There's a lot of interest in this sort of area that's sort of come about quite recently. There's actually sort of doubling time of around 2 years, so some very serious interest. But this meant that when we actually went to come and look at the number of papers, there's over 1,000, which is a crazy number. So we had to do some filtering, and what we did is we looked at all abstracts and titles that only had multi-modal and multimodal contained within them. And after that, we get down to 133 explicit papers on, as I say, multimodal, well, not necessarily disinformation, because actually, as I say, sometimes you'll find that there was, say, medicine, where the word modality is not in a communication sense, it's completely different. And of course, when you sort of factor all those out, we got down to 78 papers that were exclusively about multimodal disinformation, misinformation, and their sort of variants thereof. At which point we were able to note that 5 of these papers had computer science authors, sorry, non-computer science authors. And this sort of shows that actually what's really going on is that the exponential growth that you're seeing is actually down to computer science and the interest that they're bringing to the field. So as I say, I have this sort of a graph here that shows the proportions. So the stage 2 is very much built around what are computer scientists sort of thinking about, and crucially, how can their methods and techniques be used to further the sort of research questions of multimodal disinformation. It's also worth pointing out that there's a strong international interest in this topic, where a range of sort of social and geographic backgrounds are still contributing to this area, which is pretty interesting. I tried to tabulate this. I don't have time to go into it, but speak to me at the end if you want to. So where did the data originate for, in stage 2? Well, it was pretty lopsided. So there was a lot of data from Twitter and Chinese social media. And while there was a connection between those two, that was sort of it. It was otherwise quite sort of spread out in this, like I say, lopsided miscellaneous Venn diagram, which consisted mostly of online news articles, blogs, and other sort of hard to kind of categorize things, like maybe the odd Facebook post or something like that. So one thing, like in stage 1, that we noticed in terms of definitions was this huge use of fake news. And equally, this is why I've mentioned it, it's sort of synonymous with binary classification. Of course, fake news, we never say 0.5 fake news. We always say, fake or real news. And of course, over 90% of the papers that we saw actually demonstrated only binary classification. So this is, let's say, a dominant paradigm. And fake news is not, in the real world is never really binary, and except for some extreme cases, real disinformation is sort of more grey. So that's an issue. But perhaps the defense of computer scientists is that there are data set limitations. Most of the data sets that they have access to, and which they design their algorithms for, have labeled data as just 0, 1, fake or real. And that, in a sense, has been limiting actually the research efforts that have been coming out. There are a few data sets that have more than more than 2 labels. So, fake or real, they might go beyond this. One of them had, I think, satire. And I remember that these authors chose to actually discard all the data labeled as satire. And they also didn't then choose to actually run their multimodal analyzers on the satire. So it'd be really interesting to know what happened, because it could be the results would be so good. And all of this, in my view, or our view actually, is that this shows a lack of interdisciplinary thought, and this is driving concerning practices, like the sort of throwing out satirical data, but also in the construction of these data sets and in other areas. So let's go back to collating data, because it's such an important point. It's almost the basis of how this work is able to be performed. Are we, as a collective, academic body, missing the point? Are we factoring in risk and subtlety of mis and disinformation? Because ultimately what we need to know is something might be fake or not, whether it actually has an effect on society and who that affects and so on. And only one paper that was collating, but actually only one paper out of the entire review set actually tried to focus on human benchmarks. We found this a big surprise, because ultimately it's humans that actually interact with disinformation. But we also, there is limited engagement on attempting to understand the actual data that's being collated. So of the 7 that were collating multimodal disinformation, only 2 of them, for instance, looked at statistics on the images. For multimodal disinformation, that simply isn't enough. So there's an issue. But it's more broad than just sort of saying, well, they didn't look at images. What's really important to do is to do extremely thorough analyses of these things to make sure that the data is representative. Ultimately, if we are relying on to make claims about mis and disinformation, or using it for public good, we need to be extremely sure that what we're capturing is representative. And this comes to another thing that we noticed, something that we call survivorship bias. So when these data sets are being collated, there's a problem of how easy is it to find, as it were, fake news in order to collect it. So things that are very easy to spot get collected, and the sort of more insidious and simmering things, again, thinking about risk, might get left untouched. And so this is something that needs to be considered. Now, here is from the most cited data set. This is the Twitter data set. These are 3 examples from a paper that they were trying to show, oh, this is the fake news that's contained. And I look at this and I don't see fake news per se, I just see spam, and hope you might agree with me. This doesn't have a threat to society. It might be an inconvenience, but it is not threatening our democratic principles. Perhaps this might be a threat to our democratic principles, but when I look at it, I am not convinced. I see something with poor English, I see something that with poor image resolution. I'm not going to be worried by this. Except while it's easy for me to say this, it could be that a psychologist or a linguist or whatever other specialists might realize that there are communities who are affected by images like this. And so it's actually important at the dataset creation stage, but also at the detection stage, to be able to work out what causes harm, what's a threat to society, etc. So why is handling multimodal disinformation been so difficult, and why has it been difficult to scale up? Well, ultimately, it comes down to a couple of factors. One of them is that the inputs of multimodal disinformation can be highly uninformative. You can imagine that one of the modalities might be dragging behind one of the other ones. You might have something that's essentially unimodal, even though there are multiple modalities. But equally, there is lots of cases where the modalities interact with one another and only form the message as a result of their combination. And this is where the interdependence comes in. And this is not fixed across all examples of disinformation. So this sort of heterogeneity is almost exactly why this is one of the hardest problems that you can scale up. But it also is worse because disinformation changes over time. So even if you can somehow crack the first two, you have to have some sort of way to factor in that it is changing. This is why computer scientists had so much interest in this area, because of the sort of really great powers that we're seeing out of neural networks and other machine learning approaches. You probably all heard of ChatGPT and things like that. But ultimately, all of these techniques are black boxes. We don't actually understand why they work, but there are some sort of guiding principles, and namely, whatever we can do to make the data as easy as possible to input into one of these neural networks, the more likely that its black magic is going to do something useful. So let me sort of demonstrate how the computer scientists deal with this. So here's some input. It's a tweet, it has two modalities. It has a modality of text and a modality of image. And we're going to do some data preparation. And this is, as I say, the key stage. And this is what all of the papers that we've looked at are dealing with. So in this sort of box, we have sort of, something that deals with, say, the text modality, something that processes the image modality, and why we're sitting in this room, there's something that has a multimodal combination. So something that either looks at how modality 1 would combine with modality 2, how they communicate, or how they may not communicate, and that's also important. And of course, then we aggregate them here, and then we send them through a black box classifier, which we have very little understanding of, but we know can, in some ways, take this prepared data and give us a classification. So question 1, did the researchers, or all of them, exploit multimodal features? Somehow, not all. 23 papers, nearly a third, had 0 weighting for module 3. So they didn't really even engage with multimodal aspect of multimodal disinformation. And concerningly, a further 8 papers froze the weightings. So the kind of think of like the weightings of these arrows after their training. Now, it might be they get good results on their training data, but imagine then you wish to take this to new disinformation, which has new properties. And as I say, it does vary from disinformation example to example. That may not be enough because the intermodality correspondence might be different, in which case this is unlikely to be a robust solution, and I'm putting that politely. So the temporal variation is that we have both a spread and a practice of disinformation that changes over time. So by this, I mean like the types of disinformation might change, but also the fact that disinformation happens at a singular point and then spreads afterwards. So we can consider this in these two kind of broad categories to say nascent threats. So this is the fact that news happens now, it spreads instantaneously, and we need to be able to do something about it. 4 papers tried to deal with this sort of idea of a nascent threat by what they defined as domain dependent, so by learning domain independent and dependent features. So a domain here, they had to define a priori. This might be something as broad as, say, Syrian news, but it could be much more specific. It could be a particular event. It could be, a street in London and there's an event now or something. But as soon as you have defined this domain, there'll be features that are specific to this domain and features that should be, as it were, general. And one paper went slightly further to talk about how, if you sort of newly define one of these domains, can you do something called few shot classification? So this idea, if we have a brand new event, it's just unfolding, we have a few examples where we can say this is real and this is not real. Can we then predict what comes next? They did something called meta learning for that. Now, one of the papers did something interesting. They decided to order their data temporally. So again, in the real world, data has a sequence. This is posted first, then this, and then that. And this is something that, except for this paper, no papers actually engaged with. So in what they did is they sort of gave their neural network sort of say everything within an hour, everything within a day, and so on and so forth. And again, why is this only being thought of by so few authors? So the other thing, as I mentioned, is evolving threats. How does multimodal disinformation change over time? And the answer is no work actually has studied this at all. So please go out there and start doing it. But no, there's really interesting questions of not only the form of the multimodal disinformation, but questions of who and now what is writing it. So could it be that there are differences in the way that AI might generate multimodal disinformation? So this is really important if we want to come up with as it were, future-proof or robust solutions in this area. So let's suppose you've done all this work and you've factored all this in. There is one, I think, really important step, and we've seen some evidence of engagement in our review set, and this is explainable AI. Now, I say it's likely to be a necessary feature of any future detection implementation, because as a society, we typically demand explanations of any decisions. So whether this, whether you have like an app on your phone or like a browser extension, you would like to have some rationale as to why it's told you this is fake news or something. But this is very difficult because, as I say, these black box models are very difficult to sort of probe into. But the computer scientists are in luck. They can speak to linguists, they can speak to political scientists, they can speak to all sorts of experts who can help to decode what exactly has been found. And the reason this is all tied into all the other stuff is because there's actually a bidirectionality that shouldn't be like that, I'm sorry. So essentially, what we see is that the explainable AI, the methods to really understand what sort of the sort of machine learning programs are adopting, can also go backwards to help the specialists. So we can start to use those tools to really understand what can multimodal disinformation, how is it changing, what are the properties of it, all these things. These go hand in hand. And as I say, we did see some limited engagement. The three major ways that explainable AI sort of manifests, one of them is the direct analysis of models. So you take a machine learning model and you ask which parts of it are responding to which modalities. I mean, that is an interesting question. So could it be that certain modalities are biased in some way? Could it be that biases are generated from modalities? We don't know. Or there's limited engagement anyway. There is also a question of examination of data sets. So we didn't see very much work in general that was performed in stage 2 that looked at sort of broad, in-depth views of the type of multimodal data. But sometimes what would be done would be a machine learning practitioner would look at, they'd sort of identify a key feature that they thought was relevant, and then they would look for that key feature in their data set, and they would sort of say, well, fake news had this much and non-fake news didn't have that much, and things like that. But again, really more work should be done to really understand multimodal disinformation. And the final one is visualizations and decisions of data. Not quite as interesting as the other two, but also an important step if we're going to go forward to understand what it is that we're actually dealing with. So that's stage 2. Thanks very much. Sorry. This is a bit awkward because I accidentally put it in the wrong place. Sorry, this is not good, but it's there we go.
Right. Okay, to conclude. So based on our stage 1 and stage 2 analysis, what answers have we found to our research questions? The moment of truth. So I'm going to take one question at a time. So to what extent have studies across different disciplines engaged with multimodal analysis of dis or misinformation? Studies have shifted from primarily being in the humanities and social sciences in stage 1 to being in computer science in stage 2. But in both cases, the percentage of interdisciplinary studies is low. What is the extent of interdisciplinary practices within the field? Studies which used purely quantitative and computational methods rarely explicitly engaged with the concept of multimodality and the roles that modalities play in disinformation and misinformation communication.
Sorry, it's going to be something wrong. Do this. Is that?
No.
There we go.
No. No. Okay. Okay, so research question 2. What methods and data are used by the studies of multimodal disinformation, misinformation? Methods employed by the studies are divided roughly 50-50 between qualitative and quantitative in stage 1, but computational methods prevail in stage 2, as demonstrated. Data are often reused across multiple, mainly computer science studies. Over half of the quantitative papers used publicly available data sets in their analysis, whereas the qualitative and mixed method papers all collected data specific to their proposed questions, proposed research questions. Also, video data are rarely used. What modalities do studies engage with? Well, throughout stage 1 and stage 2, study of 2 modalities prevail. What value does multimodal analysis add according to the stages? We've observed that the majority of studies seem to appreciate the value of multimodal analysis, but they don't state this explicitly. Exceptions include emphasizing the need to analyze visual content. The analysis of visuals is seen as allowing for further insights into misinformation, message construction, the perception of disinformation, misinformation, and for boosting detection rates. Is there a well-formed research for multimodal analysis of disinformation, misinformation? There is no well-informed interdisciplinary area for research on disinformation and misinformation, and there is a need to establish one. The engagement with multimodal data seems to be the admission that the multimodal analysis of disinformation, misinformation adds value in itself, but that's probably still not enough. Well, research question 2. What are the challenges this field is facing? Well, in our view, the challenges include a lack of definitions for research objects. Well, if people can't say what misinformation, disinformation is clearly, then that's a problem. An absence of a unified terminology, which is probably not that surprising given the interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary nature of research in the field. A broad variety of research foci, a lack of new data sets, seldom use of videos. Again, we've seen that the research on 2 modalities prevailed, and videos usually require 3. Seldom engagement with analysis of big, messy data, and preference for a disciplinary approach rather than interdisciplinary. And our research question 3, what types of multimodal studies of disinformation and misinformation add value to the field, and in what ways? I must say, we thought long and hard about this, and the conclusion we drew is the types of studies we tend to add value are those which do not shy away from rising to the aforementioned challenges. We'll appreciate it's much easier to just like replicate somebody's sort of research approach design than to, do something, to take some risks. And moving forward, we think creating a more unified research landscape is needed, which will require the development of unified terminology and definitions suitable for analysis of multimodal misinformation and disinformation, as well as a conscious effort from scholars to cross boundaries of